can be heaviness, but I also feel like something's lighter after I've shared it. I guess that where I'm at in terms of my recovery and things is that I'm doing a lot of work at the moment around grief and transformation and those sorts of things. And so I feel like part of it is, yes, that self-care of having time out, of balancing it with, mindless scrolling or doing something creative and doing something that is not engaging the brain.
Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead-generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. Today on the podcast, I have Helen King. I am so excited about this conversation because we are talking a few different angles about Helen and her podcast and things that she does. But two of the most important things that I feel that we can pull from this conversation is one, how to have a podcast where you're having difficult discussions and how to balance that and maybe incorporate a little bit of a self-care, but then also about managing your time and your productivity when you have ADHD. So if you are managing your own podcast, you have ADHD, she's got some really great tips and ideas and things that she does while she's working for her podcast management company and in allowing her to get through her days and weeks feeling productive without feeling burnt out. Let's welcome Helen King to the podcast. Helen, I am so excited to chat with you today because we're going to be talking about some deep stuff that maybe people aren't talking about in the podcasting world. But before we get into all that, because I'm excited and I don't want to get ahead of myself, if you could just tell everyone who you are, what you do, and a little bit about your podcast.
Sure. So I'm so happy to be here with you. It's so exciting. So I'm Helen and I am a podcast editor / manager / podcast enthusiast. I don't know. What do I call myself?
Just a podcaster. I love podcasts. That's it.
Yeah. I said recently, there's nothing you can't learn on a podcast. There's nothing. There is nothing that you can't learn from listening to a podcast. I make a podcast called The C Word Radio, and the C stands for cancer. I had breast cancer in 2018. It was a hugely, hugely life-changing event. During lockdown last year here in New Zealand, I just really needed a project, and that's where I came to. Was I wanted to create something that really provided a platform where people could talk authentically about their cancer experiences or talk about the things that no one really talks about or people talk about in, private groups and stuff. And I've always been one for, ripping off those Band-Aids and going, no, we need to talk about this openly. So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell.
I love that so much. So going into a podcast about cancer, there's a gut punch. Did you find that when you were in the process of creating it, did you find that it was more of, this is something I need to talk about, or this is something that other people need to hear, or was it a combination of both?
It was really a combination of both. And I think part of it probably has been me, working through the post-cancer life. Because I guess anyone who's been through cancer, whether it's yourself or with a loved one, you'll know that when you are in treatment, it is all intensive. You have, an oncologist, a surgeon, all of these people around you. And then, if you get to the end of that and you're sort of considered, treated, or it was a curative process, you're then encouraged to go and live your life. And you're like, what?
Right.
What does that even mean? I really struggled in that year afterwards, and I found so do other people. And so it was kind of, I think it's kind of symbiotic. It's that thing of, I need to talk about this and other people do. When you come together, it's just this, really lovely moment where you're like, oh, this person gets me.
Yes. Oh, I love that so much because when my sister and I started our cult podcast, and it's since faded a bit, but when we started it, it was with the premise of being cult survivors ourselves and having never really processed those feelings. Our mom had since passed, and she was the one who was like in the cult, and we were kids growing up in it. So we were trying to, I guess, find ourselves in like, what happened, but also why did it happen? And we met so many people that came out of the woodworks, like, and we didn't do any interviews. It was literally just us talking about different cults, but from the perspective of cult survivors and like why people fell into these. And people would reach out and say, me too. I grew up in a cult. I grew up in a cult. Like so many people. And I think that so often, I mean, obviously the podcast is listeners to leads, right? So we're talking business podcasts typically, but there's so much power and community that can happen when you have a podcast that is also super therapeutic for you to process what you're going through. And I think that having that in someone's ears allows them to connect with you on a deeper level. And then if you decided later on, you get some certification and you want to become a coach for people who have cancer or are struggling with cancer or whatever, then you have that to fall back on like, I've processed this like outwardly, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I love what you talk about, because I think that when you go through something as monumental as, growing up in a cult or having a health crisis or, a life-threatening illness and something really major, it can be really isolating and it can be really confusing of how on earth do I process this? Because they don't teach you how to do this at any point in your life. They don't teach you how to grieve or how to, reassess. It's funny because the conversations that I have often deep. I can have quite a dark sense of humor. There is a lot of laughter as well, because sometimes you have to laugh, during chemo when your body's breaking down and you're going, seriously?
This is happening.
Yeah. So I think it really is just opening up the space and welcoming people in and saying, come and talk to me. And we can, have this shared experience in that moment. And then the power of podcasting is that other people can access that and be with you in that moment. So I think that's really special.
Yes, absolutely. So how do you balance that with a podcast that is on a deeper level and sometimes you're having hard conversations? I have one client where she talks about parenting and being a mom, and she recently had an episode that was all about miscarriages. And that one was when I was editing it, because my team was like, I cannot, I'm sorry. And I'm like, that's okay, I got it. About half a bottle of wine later, editing this episode, like, it's hard. Like, it's such an important conversation, but it's very hard to have those conversations. So how do you balance that with dark sense of humor and like live? Like, what does that usually look like for you?
I feel in some ways, because I did a few episodes on infertility or facing fertility, because it is a huge thing that many of us, both men and women and people, face when you've been younger and had things like chemo or radiation that can zap your reproductives. Yeah, it's challenging, because that is a really raw emotion, and it's challenging for me because we're facing infertility. And so it is, definitely can be heaviness, but I also feel like something's lighter after I've shared it. I guess that where I'm at in terms of my recovery and things is that I'm doing a lot of work at the moment around grief and transformation and those sorts of things. And so I feel like part of it is, yes, that self-care of having time out, of balancing it with, mindless scrolling or doing something creative and doing something that is not engaging the brain, if that makes sense. So it's kind of part of the processing, I think, and then allowing space to just for things to be light and fun. And I don't mean that to sound flippant, but it just, I think you have to have space for both. And I think that's how I manage it.
No, those are great tips. And I'm all about like mindless scrolling if that's what you need. Or like I always talk about read smut if that's what you need, like to escape what you're feeling at the moment. Or you guys can't see it because you're listening. But I have this giraffe painting behind me and I painted that, and it's a paint by number. I'm not creative, but I would love to just sit there and mindlessly fill in numbers with paint. So like find something that you can mindlessly do while either listening to a podcast, listening to music, or, scrolling through Instagram or whatever.
Yeah.
Work on that. Give yourself space, self-care, take care of yourself. And that way, when you do have those hard conversations, also creating some space before and after to feel. I was recently reading this book. It was not a self-care book or self-help book whatsoever. It was a smut book. But the person was saying in it, like allowing herself to feel feelings. And like that was not one thing that her therapist had told her. Not just sitting with them and letting them build and ruminate and just like go, but allowing them to pass through you. And I really liked that. Like just letting it feel and then, okay.
Yeah. It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, I give the benefit of talking to people and asking them how they've done things. And one of the things I've really learned from talking about grief is that there is the side that obviously is, you can talk about and that sort of thing. But actually, a lot of grief work and a lot of grief processing isn't about what's going on in your brain. It's about letting it out of your body, doing things that are, outside of the spoken. So learning that and having that space to go, I need to get this out of my body. I need to get it, whether through dance or singing at the top of your lungs or creating something. Yeah, all of those things have really helped me recently as well to balance out the heavy stuff. Yeah.
Oh, so good. So you also have ADHD, is that correct?
I sure do.
So I love to talk about managing time. A lot of people who might be listening to this podcast might be producing their own shows, or I recently talked to someone on a training I was doing on Clubhouse, and he had come up and he had asked, I'm very fly by the seat of my pants. I like to do things last minute. That's just how I flow. Whereas my wife is like, things need to be done on time. We need to plan ahead. And so for the podcast, how do I balance that? And I think it really is. Like I told him, like it starts first with like know thyself, right? Know what is going on in your brain and know how you work. But I'd love to hear some strategies that you use and what your tips and strategies are for those. You put your heart and your soul into your show. And I want to help you reach all of those potential listeners out there. That's why I'm excited to announce my upcoming podcast marketing workshop. It's about giving you practical tools to grow your audience. You'll learn the secrets to getting your podcast discovered, attracting your dream listeners, and boosting those download numbers. This workshop will be hosted live with a replay available on April 30th. You can sign up by going to galatimedia.com/workshop. Let's grow our podcasts together.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am only recently diagnosed. I was diagnosed last year, a few months before turning 40. So I have decades of unlearning to do. I am really lucky that part of my management is the fact that I have decided to not work in a traditional environment because that does not suit me at all. I do not work well in an office or a corporate space. That's the first thing for me, is really understanding myself, understanding how I work and what brings out the best in me. And I'm really, really lucky. I have a very supportive partner, and he he has supported me. So I'm able to have this time to go, I want to build this business. And so this is an ADHD friendly employment option for me. So the first thing really is understanding what my rhythms are. I can really fluctuate during the month or how productive I feel. Mm-hmm. Anyone with ADHD will understand that you have days where you have no energy at all. You know, you might have been overstimulated the day before, and so the next day you've got nothing in the tank. I can kind of shift and juggle my week around with when I need to be very productive, like editing my clients' podcast or, creating their content and things, and just putting it in times where I know I'm going to have more capability to sit down and concentrate. So I'm much better in the morning. So as the day goes on, I get more and more burnt out. So that's been the major thing for me, is understanding what is my rhythm. when am I going to be at my peak so I can sit down and do this? I mean, there are lots of different tips and tricks that I'm learning along the way. At the moment, and this is working for me, is that I looked up bullet journaling because someone had mentioned it, and it looks far too complicated for me. There's a lot of drawing.
It is very complicated. Yes, I've tried it and got like maybe 4 months in and was like, I'm done.
Yeah.
This isn't it.
That's a lot of effort. So I'm doing my version of it where the day before or the night before I sit down and I think, what are the things in my day I want to do for my self-care? Because that's really important. And that goes at the top of the list. And then I think about what do I need to achieve tomorrow? And I just put those down. And then I have, what do I need to do around the house or other, life chores and that sort of thing. And then I don't put any expectation on myself to achieve any of it. So if I don't achieve all of those things, it doesn't matter. There are some things on there that I think I have to do that tomorrow. Otherwise, it's probably pushing it. Yeah. And so that's kind of how I manage it. There are other times in the month where things aren't good. My ADHD might be out the door. That's the time where I go, I am not making any appointments during that week. So I don't schedule in any meetings. I don't schedule anything where I have to go and be somewhere. And I take all of the stress and pressure off myself because I know that stuff might be too overwhelming. And so it's just, different ways of managing it. In terms of a podcast, I think I'm lucky that I really love it. And so it never really feels too much like a chore to me. I think anyone with ADHD will recognize that, if you don't like it and find it boring, it's painful to do because it's not producing dopamine.
Right.
And we don't like that. Yeah, so it is a little bit about planning and putting things in. Sometimes it's tricking myself and saying, I'll sit down and do this, just do it for, 5-10 minutes. And if it's really crap, you don't have to do it anymore.
That's so great.
Yeah, I think those are the main ones that help me be able to have a work production.
I feel like that's applicable too for those of us. I mean, I'm not diagnosed. I've questioned sometimes. But for those of us who aren't diagnosed ADHD, like, it's so important to know even your biorhythm throughout the day of when you feel most productive, especially when those of us who have come from corporate jobs where it's 9 to 5 and that is it. And you have to take a 1 hour lunch break. I don't work 9 to 5 at all. I need to work sometimes 10 to about noon. I'll take about an hour break. But my most productive time of the day is from 11 a.m. until 3 p.m. And then again from 7 p.m. till about 11 p.m. at night. Evenings, I'm a night owl. I like to work nights. I like doing that. And so obviously my husband wants to hang out. So I have to make time for him too in the evenings. But when football's on and I'm not watching that, then I know I can work every Monday night and every Thursday night when football is on, especially during football season. And I don't have to worry about him feeling like, oh, I want to hang out. I want to watch a movie. What are you doing? You're always working. No, there's none of that. So I can still hone in on that time that I like to work. So knowing when that time is for you and testing it out and having fun with it. Obviously, if you're in a corporate job, it's going to be more difficult to create a schedule that works for you, but have conversations with those who are your superiors and find ways that it will work for you and that you're going to be more productive. I think you agree with me. It goes back to knowing yourself and knowing what works for you.
Yeah, it is really challenging because one of the things with ADHD is we often find it hard to start tasks. It's this weird mind block. I don't know what it is, but sometimes and that's why I was saying I can trick myself and say, oh, just grab the laptop and do it.
Just a few minutes.
A little bit and see how it goes. You touched on it there, and I think this is a really important thing because a lot of people now, it isn't really post-pandemic because I feel like this is now we're feeling out what this new life is. But a lot of people might be working from home. And for me, it has been, you don't have to sit at the desk. You can sit on the couch with your laptop and you're still working if that's comfortable for you for a bit. Or this week I've really taken the pressure off and taken the dogs out in the morning and not being like, oh, I have to rush back and you have to get back to work. It's like, no, they're having fun. We'll go for a walk and I'll come back and I'll sit down. And I think it really is getting out of that corporate mindset of you have to be at your desk. And if you're not at your desk, you're not being productive, and going, actually, I think I'll drive out to mum and dad's and go see them and take the dog. I'm not feeling in that productive zone.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than sit and berate myself for not being productive, I'll go and, see mum and dad who, because of the pandemic, I don't get to see very much. So I think it is shifting that mindset from you have to be productive at all times, otherwise your worth isn't high, and going, actually, what do I need today to really meet my needs for what they are in this moment? Yeah. And I'm not saying I do that perfectly.
Right. No, I totally understand. I also think that we need to shift this idea of productivity around on its head, because going and visiting your mom and dad and hanging out with them is also productive for your mental health. So like we always think we have to be doing in order to be productive, but sometimes just being is productive too.
Yeah. It's really interesting because I think having cancer really taught me this. It's an unlearning in a way where when everything is taken away from you, and I mean, because my background's in journalism and corporate communication, so I've a lot of the time being a high achiever. Like I wanted to achieve. I put these huge expectations on myself, pushing. And like a lot of people who were undiagnosed with either autism or ADHD, I had that boom bust cycle. And so I'd be push, then I'd burn out. Completely and utterly burn out. And I did that a few times, and I did it the last time really was before my cancer diagnosis. The chemo was so full on, I couldn't work. And so all of that was taken away. Like your physical health was taken away. My ability to work was taken away. And you realize that not much actually matters that we think matters. And so now I don't know, it's almost ruined me in a way, because I just don't have that desire anymore to wreck myself for a job, because I just think that's not what matters to me anymore.
Yeah, when you're faced with your own mortality, it's like this moment of, what am I doing? Whether that's through a health issue with yourself, or you lose someone you love and you just realize like life is really short. What's the point? Like, what am I doing with this?
Totally. Yeah, I grappled with it because you're talking about the why, when you talked about your own experience of growing up in a cult and having those, I guess, those questions of why me? Why did this happen? And I can kind of equate it with having cancer as you think, why on earth did this happen? Was it because I did this, or was it this? And the fact is that it wasn't anything we did. It happened,
Right.
You had a parent that made those decisions, and I had a body that made the bloody decisions to get out of control. You do spend a lot of time thinking, gosh, what was going on? And what I kept coming back to was, God, you haven't been listening to your body. Your body's been screaming at you for years to slow down, and I wasn't listening. And that's a big, F you of your listen is having to be completely grounded. So I've really have explored that idea of, that cult of productivity or that achievement and stuff. What does that really mean? And how do I shift this? So, there are different things that matter.
Oh, so good. So good. Yes. So you have also gotten clients from your podcast. So I would love to dive into that. What happened? I want to know all the things.
I was really lucky, I think, that podcasting has been a saving grace for me, I think, because it has allowed me to set up a small business for myself where I can work from home and build a more healthy and well lifestyle. I'm lucky that I have that background in journalism and radio production. So I had those skills, and I discovered, oh my God, other people will pay you to do this stuff. Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
I was a guest on a podcast last year called Adulting with ADHD, and I was sharing my experience because I had followed Sarah, the host, on Twitter. In that episode, I was talking about, coming to podcasting and the fact that I was starting to edit for other people. And she was like, I need an editor. And so that was how I got my first client.
Awesome. I love that so much.
Which is hilarious. And then I actually produced a small podcast series for a charity here in New Zealand. That was after they started following me on Instagram and they'd heard my podcast. Yeah, and they wanted me to create something for them. And so those have been avenues for me. And then recently, and I think this might be, of interest to other people who are starting out, whether it's in podcast editing or just freelancing, is that I've had people find me through LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. And so I post and share and those sorts of things. And yeah, I'm starting to get, a friend referred me. It was like, I found you on LinkedIn. Yeah, so that is pretty cool to sort of start getting that organic
yes.
growth.
Yeah, the referrals are great, but once you start getting people who, like I had a potential client call a few weeks ago where she was like, I saw your article on the Buzzsprout newsletter, then I went and read it, and then I listened to the episode, and then I went to your Instagram, and then I checked out your Instagram. I liked what you do, and then I booked a call. Like, this lady does it, like, literally within an hour's time. Was like, oh, yeah, no, I need to work with you. So it's like, if you put the right content out there, you're having the right conversations, then it's so much easier to get people to trust you, especially with podcasting.
Absolutely. And sometimes you don't have to be a podcaster to be able to edit and things. If you have the skills and you have the ear for it, that's great. I think for me, my podcast is an outward kind of, well, this is what I can do. These are my skills and this is what I've created. And then when you are consulting with people or you're advising people, you can say, this is what's worked for me, or I've been trying this recently. Do you want to try it on your podcast as well? And I think there is that degree of trust then because they go, oh, yeah, I mean, you get what I'm doing.
Yes. You are picking up what I'm putting down. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, this was so good. Thank you so much for all that you have shared. And we definitely will have to connect again because this was so good. If anyone wants to listen to your podcast or they want to work with you, where can they find you, hang out with you?
Yeah, so if you want to listen to the podcast, I'm on all the major podcast distribution platforms, the C Word Radio, or come find me on Instagram as well. I love chatting with people, or, if you're going through cancer and you want to talk to someone about what's going on, please get in touch. Otherwise, I am also on Instagram with my business. It's HKProductions_podcast. And if you want to talk podcasting, I am always happy to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Helen, for coming on the show. Yes, this was so good.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.